Ladies and gentlemen, there's nobody who's going to fight harder for the rights of Virginia to choose its own destiny. There's nobody who is a more principled man than my friend Ken Cuccinelli. Let's have a round of applause for Ken.
Thank you, Rob. And Rob still doesn't hold 2 a.m. meetings against me, which is very kind of him. I will tell you consequences before I get into of the fight that we had and that is still going on. We're still trying to get property rights protection in the Constitution. We got a bill, but it's just a bill. Later legislatures, every year Rob and I sit there, get a bunch of other bills that look to whittle away what we work so hard to provide for the people of Virginia, and that's simple property rights protection. And judges need away at it too. It needs to be in our Constitution. And I'll tell you, Pat Henry, who you about here, was George Mason, voted against our U.S. Constitution in Virginia's Convention in June of 1788. Against it because it didn't protect property rights and other individual rights. That's why they did it. And of course, even today, we don't have property rights protected in Virginia's Constitution. That is a major effort, I know, for your delegate, Rob Bell, and it continues to be a major. My effort on the constitutional front is to get that protection where it belongs, and that's in the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Patrick, I appreciate the support and all being here. You know, the first Tea Party was just about taxes. Bailout too. The British East India Company was bankrupt, and through their political on tea sales, no hat sales, just on the sale of tea and of course the taxing of it in the colonies. And there was a 1.4 million pound, not in weight, but British dollars, 1.4 million pound bailout. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. Sounds awfully familiar. Emphasis on the awful. But that's the history of where this began. And we're here today in a time where we've got a president appointing the CEO of private companies that are now run by his allies, the unions, and not even the union members. You know, I might be a little more comfortable with that. But where I live, I get the Washington Times. I don't get the Post, but I get the Times. And they ran some articles on union members of GM in particular who had bought bonds in GM and who were wiped out because the union got their ownership. And talk about the importance of protecting property rights. These were individual people, their faces were on the front of the newspaper, and their retirements were wiped out because they weren't among the politically connected. They weren't with the British East India Company. They weren't with the UAW. They didn't have the connections to sustain their own property because government was deciding who got to keep their property and who was going to lose it. And is it any surprise that it was the politically connected whose property was protected? That's what happens when you don't have the right to protect your property. It's at the whim of government. And that's why Patrick Henry and George Mason voted against the Constitution, because it hadn't yet protected those individual rights. That's why that's so important. That's why that's so important. And you know, after the bailout in 1773, next came the taxes. And of course, that's what we all associate that Tea Party with, was an objection to being taxed. And what happened last Friday? Cap and tax. Passed the House. I see Perriello signs here. You can tell him I said hello. I'm sure he's happy I'm in his district. But that is a tax bill. Greenpeace opposes the cap and trade bill. What does that tell you? Greenpeace, I mean, they're not, you know, rational, middle-of-the-road folks. They will do anything if they think it'll save an ant in Red China. And even a black ant, not just red ants. They will do anything. And they say it won't do a thing for the environment. So what does that tell you? That tells you it's a tax bill. That's all it's about. It's about taxes and controlling the economy through that regulatory process. And the federal government is looking to shove those regulations down the throats of states. And it's time states reminded the federal government who created who. Who created who? The federal government is the creation of the states, and I I am honored, I got to mention it while I'm up here, I am honored to be running for the office that decides in Virginia whether the Commonwealth of Virginia is going to take the federal government on under the 10th Amendment. I'm running to be the next Attorney General of Virginia. And where better than Virginia to start this fight back? Where better? You've already heard from Patrick Henry, George Mason, Thomas Jefferson. I tell people, of course I'm parochial, I favor Virginia, but we had all the founding fathers that drew up this government except John Adams. We had them all. James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and so on and so on. I hope everybody here knows who we're talking about. I know you all do. That's a history we need to be reminded of, and the principles that they articulated are what we need to get this government back to. That's the model. That's the model. It's those principles. They weren't perfect. Nobody's been perfect for 2,000 years or so. But they got the principles right. And they're timeless. They apply everywhere. And they apply right here, even in Charlottesville. How about that? Even in Charlottesville, they apply everywhere, and we need to reform our government based on those founding principles. That's what we need to get back to. That's what we need to get back to. One part of that is fighting off the federal intrusion. You know, those of you who know what right to work, this interesting law we have in Virginia that doesn't require you to be forced to join a union to get a job. We're one of 20 some odd states that have that. Federal government wants to undo that. They want to shove regulations down our throat with cap and tax. They also want to stop, with their allies, the Sierra Club, want to stop Virginia from regulating its own businesses. Who do you think they want to do that? They want the federal government to do that, because they know better than we do, right? They know better than we do. And that is the agenda in Washington. That's the agenda that their allies are reaching into Virginia to execute. And we need to be prepared to fight back. And 2009 is a year Virginia gets to shine again in history by fighting back against this kind of tyranny and pushing it back across the Potomac as best we can. I'm so pleased to be able to join with you all. I'm pleased to be with people who appreciate not only our history, but the importance that it plays in deciding what we should be doing today. It does matter today. We have the history to reflect that so many of our leaders today want to ignore. They want to ignore it, and that's on both sides of the aisle. You know, we talked about bailouts. In September, it was a Republican bailout. That wasn't any better than the one in February. Wasn't any better. Wasn't any better at all. And we need, you know, the Chinese are going to run out of money to lend us eventually. And, you know, is that who you want pulling your purse strings? They can shut down our government in 90 days. Just by stopping borrowing money. Here in Virginia, when Rob and I vote for a budget, it has to be balanced. Your family budget has to be balanced. Your business budget has to be balanced. I remember a line John McCain said during the presidential election, and he was good on spending. He got this one right. He said, you know, saying that, at the time he was talking about his fellow Republicans, saying that Republicans were spending like drunken sailors is offensive to drunken sailors. Now, I don't want to offend any drunken sailors here today. I will thank you for your service on July 4th, but that is an attitude we need back in Washington. We've got it. We're fighting over it in Richmond, but in Richmond, it's really fighting around the edges. We need to take back our government. We need to do it one state at a time, one city at a time, one election at a time. So I hope you'll help me out in 2009, and you'll help Rob Bell out in 2009. You got a great delegate who respects the Constitution here, and I'd like to be your next Attorney General and fight for that Constitution against the folks in Washington. Thank you all. God bless you. Happy 4th of July. Thanks very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, your next Attorney General, Ken Cuccinelli.